Hi everyone, I'm Eric. Let's talk some more about France. Around 3 years after the last war, the 9 Years' War, Charles II of Spain died without an heir. He was the last Habsburg in Spain and had ruled over a vast global empire. There were attempts to peacefully portion out parts of the empire between the eligible candidates in order to avoid war, but this failed. The candidates were the royal houses of France, Austria, and Bavaria, or the Bourbons, Habsburgs, and Wittelsbachs. Charles II wanted to give the entire inheritance to a man called Philip, the Duke of Anjou, which was the second oldest grandson of Louis XIV. Charles II had a list of people he'd give the inheritance to in case of Philip's refusal. The Austrians were not that high up on that list and had issues with it. In short, Philip did become the King of Spain. But the actions of Louis XIV heightened the fear of other European powers. He did, amongst other things, cause the court in Paris to register a decree that if Philip's elder brother died without an heir, the throne of Spain would go to France, basically. The Sun King had great plans of expanding the House of Bourbon, just like the Habsburgs had done it before. Louis XIV kept doing his thing and even occupied parts of the Spanish Netherlands. This sparked a sort of powder keg created by the unresolved issues of the last war. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and some Holy Roman Empire allies reformed the Grand Alliance from the last war and supported the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I's claim that the whole inheritance would go to his second son, Archduke Charles. The alliance formally declared war in May 1702. The alliance had success in the beginning, but the unity broke down and they were defeated in Spain. The participants fought to strengthen their negotiation positions. A treaty was then signed in 1715, 13 years after the war started. Parts of Spain, among other territories, were ceded to the Habsburgs, but Philip V remained King of Spain in the end. However, he had to renounce any claim to the throne of France. He then reigned until 1746. This war was ruinous to France, and the country was on the verge of collapse. But they had managed not to lose any territories, and also got a relatively good peace treaty. Then, Louis XIV, aka Louis the Great, aka the Sun King, died shortly after, having ruled France for 72 years. Obviously, there was discontent in France during these wars. The people suffered immensely, but it was nothing like what we will see in 70-ish years from now. The crown then went to Louis XIV's great-grandson, Louis XV, aka Louis the Beloved. He was only 5 years old when this happened though, so Philip II, Duke of Orleans, was regent until Louis XV was of age. During this time, France saw a return to peace and prosperity. This was also due to the fact that Europe was totally exhausted after the two major wars. It got interrupted by small conflicts like War of the Polish Succession in 1733. They were back to large-scale warfare with the War of the Austrian Succession in 1740. Once again, like we saw in the 14th century when Charles VI died, Salic law was a problem. Maria Theresa was under Salic law ineligible to succeed the Habsburg thrones. It is said that Salic law was but an excuse for Prussia and France to challenge the Habsburg power. Austria was supported by Great Britain and the Dutch Republic, the old enemies of France. In the end, Maria became ruler. France was in many ways victorious, and Louis XV didn't want to come across as a conqueror, so he gave all of the conquests made during the war back, saying, "I'm the King of France, not a merchant." This decision, or move, was largely misunderstood by his generals and also the French people, and it made him very unpopular. Louis XV made the Jews not worth the squeeze in their eyes. The war lasted between 1740 and 1748. Just a few years later, in 1756, war between Great Britain and France broke out, in what very much was a world war called the 7 Years' War. The conflict basically split Europe into two coalitions, one led by the Kingdom of Great Britain, including Prussia, Portugal, Hanover, and other German states. Even the Mughal Empire, with support from the French, fought against the British in India. There had already been some skirmishes between Great Britain and France in North America in 1754. It is said, however, that the conflict was mostly centered on Austria's desire to recover Silesia from the Prussians. France and Austria, once bitter rivals, saw the opportunity to curtail Britain's and Prussia's ever-growing might. Once again, this idea of power balance has been a recurring theme in history. Anyway, France and Austria basically lost the war. French supremacy in Europe was crushed, and therefore altered the European balance of power. Was the once mighty French superpower on its way out? France lost a bunch of North American colonies to the British. This surely did not make the already angry French population any happier. The whole 18th century saw growing discontent with the monarchy and the established order. Louis XV, Louis the Beloved, was very unpopular and is almost portrayed as a bad monarch, and he is said to ignore the clear signs of discontent. He wasn't long for this world, though, and died of smallpox in 1774. During this time, Great Britain is experiencing the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The rising middle class in France felt frustrated with the French system and silly, incompetent rulers. The system was not feudal per se, but at the same time it wasn't modern either. There were feudal elements left in the system, though. After Louis XV died, his grandson, Louis XVI, became king and was at first popular with the French people. But the powder keg that is the French Revolution is being prepared as we speak. Louis XVI is said to have been a weak ruler. He was married with the famous Austrian Archduchess Marie Antoinette. She is portrayed as naive, stupid, silly, and maybe even an elitist. If that's actually the case or not is a different subject, but suffice it to say, she wasn't very popular either. All these wars that France had participated in were very expensive, and one of the straws that broke the camel's back was the intervention in the US War of Independence. You could say there were no victory for France in this conflict. France was now deeply in debt, and Louis XVI permitted radical reforms to improve the situation. There were political quarrels, and one can say that the attempts were not effective and were very unpopular with the population anyway. A harsh winter in 1788 gave the powder keg a fuse to be lit. The causes of the French Revolution are very complex and to this day is debated by historians. Financial problems and things like bad harvest inflamed popular resentment for the upper classes, who didn't seem to suffer the same way as the populace did. And let it not be forgotten that we are in the times of the Enlightenment, as it's called. These ideas also affected the French Revolution. Ideas like liberty, tolerance, constitutional government, separation between church and state, and so on. The conflict itself is complex as heck, but suffice it to say, the monarchy was abolished in 1792 and the First French Republic was proclaimed. The Ancien Régime, or Old Regime, that had been alive for over 300 years was now dead. Historians widely regarded the revolution as one of the most important events in human history. It triggered a global decline of absolute monarchies and replaced them with republics and liberal democracies. The monarchies of the time were very scared of this. It was terrifying to see the monarchy of Europe being toppled. They actually intervened and tried to support the old French monarchy, but to no avail. You could say they helped create an enemy for themselves. The revolution is a fascinating tale full of drama and terrible events. It also meant differences when it comes to war. All of a sudden, the people were armed, something the monarchies always feared. What this meant is that armies now were exponentially bigger, and this was unique. There were no republics in Europe during this time. So basically, France's military capabilities got a steroid shot. The long-time effects were not only felt in Europe, but also the New World. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte took control of the Republic and became the first consul. Then, through political and perhaps even dubious maneuvers, he became the Emperor of France in 1804. During the ceremony, 2 separate crowns were brought in. A golden laurel wreath that recalled the Roman Empire and a replica of Charlemagne's crown. He hadn't been emperor for long. Actually, he wasn't even emperor when the War of the Third Coalition broke out. On one side, there was the Holy Roman Empire, the Russian Empire, the United Kingdom, the 2 kingdoms of Naples and Sicily, and also Sweden. On the other side, there was France, and some satellites like Spain. The war lasted between 1803 and 1806, and, as you probably guessed, Napoleon won. This resulted in the consolidation of the French Empire and the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. The peace only lasted a few months, though, and in 1806 the War of the Fourth Coalition broke out. The alliances looked pretty much the same, but now Prussia had joined the coalition. The war didn't even last a year and ended once again with a French victory. Russia and France were now allies in a sort of forced marriage or something, and Prussia lost half its territory. Later, the same year, the Peninsular War broke out, which expanded in 1809 to the, can you guess it? Yeah, the War of the Fifth Coalition. This war, once again, was also short-lived, and only lasted between April and October. Once again, Napoleon won. The war resulted in a Franco-Austrian alliance and the Illyrian provinces. The Peninsular War I mentioned earlier was a war for the Iberian Peninsula and continued after the War of the Fifth Coalition. Other than this war, there was general peace in Europe. And this wasn't really Napoleon's style, so he decided to invade Russia in 1812. This war was ruinous for Napoleon, and he was never the same afterwards. The gigantic landmass of Russia proved difficult for his army, and not to mention the famous General Winter, meaning the extremely harsh winters of Russia. Napoleon and his Grand Army staggered back into Europe, and the war only lasted for 5 months. Then, in 1813, the War of the Sixth Coalition broke out. This coalition was huge. It comprised of Russia, Prussia, Austria, the United Kingdom, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, Sicily, and Sardinia. And later on, more countries joined in, among others, the Netherlands. This proved too much though, and Napoleon lost, and the war ended in 1814. This ended in the Treaty of Fontainebleau. Is that how you pronounce it? The Allies exiled Napoleon to Elba, an island in the Mediterranean, which they let him be the emperor of. Have you ever lost a war in EU4 and had to give up a few provinces? Napoleon went from being the emperor of Europe, almost, to the emperor of a small island with 12,000 inhabitants. This period of exile is known as the 100 Days, which was actually 111 days. Napoleon, in a somewhat sneaky way, returned to France and started his march towards Paris. Along the way, people joined him and he started to amass an army. Napoleon returned to power in March of 1815. The Congress of Vienna declared him an outlaw, and Austria, Prussia, Russia, and the United Kingdom bound themselves to put 150,000 men each into the field to end his rule once and for all. This led to the last conflict in the Napoleonic Wars, the iconic Battle of Waterloo. This was the 7th and last of the coalitions. In short, the battle was decisive and Napoleon lost. Napoleon had 73,000 men versus the coalition's 118,000. Napoleon suffered 41,000 casualties and the coalition had around 24,000. This ended what's known as the First French Empire. It also ushered in general peace in Europe, meaning no major wars. Later, in 1852, the president of the French Republic, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew, was proclaimed emperor of what's known as the Second French Empire. The new president was, however, unseated following the defeat of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, and the regime was replaced by the Third Republic. The so-called General Peace was ended by the Crimean War, and later, and more importantly, the First World War. We're now past 1821, where EU4 ends, but let's keep going just a little bit longer. By the way, if you want to know more about the First World War, I can highly recommend Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast, where he tells the story of the First World War. Anyway, the Allies, which France was a part of, won the war after a 4-year-long brutal conflict. This war scarred Europe forever. Only looking at the military casualties, 5.5 million soldiers died on the Allied side. The Central Powers lost around 4.4 million. The total casualty number lands at a staggering 39 million. These are casualties though, and not necessarily deaths. The war crippled Europe, but most of all, Germany in a brutal peace treaty, and led directly to the Second World War, which was also terribly brutal, and is considered the most brutal of all wars. In World War II, the French was conquered very quickly, and, in a sense, losing their famous military reputation. In the end, the Allies won, and France was liberated. We began way before 1444 and ended up quite a bit after 1821, but hopefully this episode gave you a small grasp of French history. Let me know what you think. Should these episodes be as long as this, or should I shorten it? This is the first episode I've ever made, and I'm not very used to talking into a microphone, neither am I used to editing, so hopefully you guys will give me some slack. I will attempt to make more episodes, short and long, and with time, the quality should improve anyway. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Eric. Until next time.